Dialog from the very beginning. In fact, he was the one who established this center when he was the Deputy Vice Chancellor of Yuan. Now, Confucianism and Islam will still remain relevant and still relevant and will continue to be relevant for many, many hundreds of thousands of years to come. The understanding of it. So it's a country like Malaysia with major believers in Islam and also Chinese Confucianists. We hope the dialogue can be very fruitful here and can develop here. And the role of Chinese Muslim in developing civilizational dialogue between Confucianism and Islam. These are among the things that has been touched by Professor just now. And now I would like to call upon Professor Daniel Bell for the second keynote address. Professor Bell was born in 1964 and a Canadian political theorist, currently chair of political theory at the University of Hong Kong Faculty of Law, previously Dean of School of Political Science and Public Administration at Shandong University and Professor of Tsinghua University at the College and Department of Philosophy. Prof. Bell has written many books. Among them is the Dean of Shandong, Confession of a Minor Bureaucratical of a Chinese University, and China Model Political Bureaucracy and Limits of Democracy, and many other books, I think about 10 to 12 books. He was also the advisor for many universities in the United States, in Princeton too, for the translation project, and also is involved in many journals, academic journals throughout the world. With such a short introduction, I would like to call upon Mr. Bell to deliver his second keynote address.
Apa kabar? 大家好. So I'm very honored to be here, and let me thank the Vice Chancellor, Professor Rector Osman Dakar, Professor Datuk Azizan, and Professor Farah Kimbong for the invitation as well, and distinguished members of the audience at the University of Malaya, the Center of Civilizational Dialogue, and the Center of Research on Southeast Asia Studies, as well as members of the Islam Dialogue Society in the audience of the University of Malaya. I don't know if we have a PPT. Oh yes, we have it in back. Okay. So, perfect, thank you. So, my talk, we live in times of global disorder, and I thought we needed to have the views of some philosophers who are idealists, they have moral ideals, but they also are political realists who think of how to engage with each other in times of chaos and disintegration, and especially how to forge ties of communal solidarity in these dark times. And I selected two thinkers from each tradition, one from the Confucian tradition, Xunzi, and one from the Islamic tradition, Ibn Khaldun, from the 14th century or so. They both have a similar problem. How, in these dark times of chaos, how can we establish ties of communal solidarity? So it's quite fascinating that we have both thinkers thinking about similar issues, and I think by putting them in dialogue with each other, they could learn from each other, and also could help us think about how in these times of global disintegration, how we could establish more of this solidarity with each other. So let's go to the next slide, please. So very quickly, methodological considerations for civilizational dialogue. I mean, one is the kind of old-fashioned with colonial, imperial approach, or the missionary approach, where you go there as a teacher to another culture and tradition, and you want to convert them to your own ways. And I think most of us would reject that approach today, so let's move on to the second slide, please. So then we have this mutual understanding approach, which I think is so important, that we want to understand each other, right? The Confucians want to understand the Islamic tradition want to understand the Confucian tradition. Understand what are the commonalities and what are the differences. And this is important, especially for political reasons, because once we have better understanding, then it's easier to resolve our conflicts and to live together peacefully. But let's move on to the third approach. Next slide, please, which we can call, well, I wrote the creative approach, but maybe a better formulation is the mutual improvement approach, where each tradition engages with another tradition, not just for the purpose of understanding the other tradition, but for the purpose of mutual improvement, that I can understand what the problems are in my tradition by learning from the other tradition and vice versa. And I think that's what we've been doing here with these, with the Islam Confucian dialogues for the past 30 years. And I hope to make a little tiny contribution by focusing on these two thinkers, as mentioned earlier, Xunzi and Ibn Khaldun. So Xunzi, he's quite fascinating, and my own area of expertise is political theory, and to my mind, he's the greatest political theorist in the Confucian tradition. I mean, his work is as important as Plato's Republic in the Western tradition of political theory, and he was writing in the darkest period of Chinese history. It was the worst times of the Warring States period. Constant violence, massacres, huge amounts of killings. And he was writing in these times of chaos. So naturally, he still was a Confucian. His ideas had Confucian moral foundation, but he was also a realist, saying how in these dark times can we promote these Confucian ideals? So let's look at the next slide. So his views of human nature, again, he was writing in very dark times, so it's not surprising that he would have a somewhat pessimistic view, where he argued that people are born with a tendency to badness, 性恶 in Chinese. And basically he argues that if people blindly follow their natural inclinations, this will lead to chaos and to aggressiveness and exploitation. And the powerful are sure to dominate and to exploit and kill those who have less power. So he says here, we can read his quote, humans are born with desires. When they have desires, but do not get the objects of their desires, they cannot but seek some means of satisfaction. And if there's no limit to their seeking, then they cannot help but struggle with each other. And then there'll be chaos, and then everybody will be impoverished. So, let's move on to the next slide, please. The question is, how can we avoid that? Well, people can improve. So his student, Han Feizi, who systematized a legalist tradition, Jia, he had the opposite view. He said people are born bad and they stay bad. But his teacher, in this sense, was more optimistic. He says we can improve by means of deliberate effort. First, by means of learning. If we have a commitment to learning from the sages of the past, it takes a lifetime process of learning, but we can improve from a moral point of view. So it's not just a matter of studying for intellectual purposes, but also for the purposes of moral improvement. We can make progress. So this is hugely important. But what's another way? Let's move on to the next slide, please. He says, well, we also need great teachers. Once we have great teachers, then they could serve as morals and they could inspire us. So again, he would be very critical of, for example, replacing teachers with AI, because AI cannot serve as a great teacher. A great teacher has to inspire, also by having suffering and vulnerability and showing how they can overcome suffering and vulnerability. That's one way in which people can improve, is by learning from great teachers, not by machines, but by great teachers who inspire through their model, through the way that they lead their lives. But that's the second way. But even most important is the third way. It's by means of rituals accompanied by music, 礼乐 in Chinese. So the slides are too small to read directly, so let me go to my notes here, if you'll give me a minute. So basically, he argues that the key to transformation, in other words, how can we move from this tendency to badness to become better people, to become good people? And he argues it's by participating in these rituals. So these ancient exemplary rulers, they hated chaos. So they established rituals and rightness in order to divide things between people, to civilize their desires, to satisfy their seeking, and they caused desires never to exhaust material goods. Never to be depleted by desires, that the two can support each other and prosper. This is how ritual arose. So we could learn to regulate our natural desires so there's a better fit between what we want and the goods available in society. And then, as a result, we will have social peace, material well-being, and harmony, and communal solidarity. Rituals, they provide the bonds that do not rely solely on kinship or family, so that the whole larger society can partake of the benefits of cooperative social existence in larger societies. This is so important. So rituals that we have every day, shaking hands and raising hands and attending funerals and mourning rituals and marriage rituals, these are all so important for having a better society. Let's move on to the next slide, please. So, again, it's not just rituals, but they have to be accompanied by music as well. Now that sounds a little bit strange perhaps, but the point here is that rituals, they have to trigger an emotional response because our natural emotions are not necessarily positive, but by participating in rituals that make us feel oneness and a sense of community, we can change our emotions so that we become a better people and we can expand our love and care for people. But to trigger this emotional response, they have to be accompanied by music. So that's why in Chinese it's so important. We still use this term today, 礼乐. Any beautiful society, harmonious society with lots of communal solidarity has to be accompanied by rituals and music. That's why the great sage rulers of the past invented rituals, invented music to accompany the rituals. So, they cause the progression, the complexity, intensity, and rhythm of music to be sufficient. They have to move the goodness in people's hearts. So when you hear music performed in ancestral temples, then everybody, yes, there's hierarchy, but the rulers and ministers, peers and inferiors, everybody listens to it together, and then they all become harmoniously respectful. And this could lead people in a unified way. And this is the key to communal solidarity. And he was writing in the Warring States period. We need to have unified people with communal solidarity. Very practical purposes. To have victory in war, we have to have a strong sense of solidarity. But also in terms of peace, we need it so that those with power come to care about those with less power, come to care about the needy. That's so important for Xunzi. Next slide, please. But we need to recognize that his thoughts have limitations because really, if the aim is to create a sense of communal solidarity, we do need commitment to learning, we need great teachers, and we need rituals accompanied by beautiful music. But in a society like Japan, which are very harmonious, communal, there's ethnic homogeneity, same language, times of peace. It's a society that's largely regulated by rituals and music, and yes, you do have communal solidarity. But what about societies like Malaysia or Canada, where I'm from, which are very multicultural, with different languages and traditions and religions? Maybe rituals and music are not sufficient. And if you look at history, the way that it works, it seems that sometimes, frankly, having an external threat or even an enemy is important for generating a sense of communal solidarity. I mentioned I'm from Canada. Canadians don't have a strong sense of communal solidarity or nationalism or patriotism until recently. Now they do. Why? Because Donald Trump threatens to invade Canada and turn us into the 51st state. So Canadians now have a sense. Okay, so let me quickly move on to the last thinker, Ibn Khaldun. So he was an Islamic scholar who was widely regarded as the forerunner of in social science, hugely important. And his work had Islamic moral foundations, but he was also a political realist. He was writing in the times also of chaos. We can call